part 7 of our conversation with Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull. I'm John Beaudin from Rock History Music. Did you have a relationship with Led Zeppelin back in the day? There's that rumor that Jimmy Page walked in during the recording of Aqualung. Was that true?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, we performed on a lot of shows with Led Zeppelin and from '69 onwards. But when they were just becoming a headline band, and we were, on our first tour or two, then we were the opening act for Zeppelin in a few shows, and it was a very educational experience to watch these guys. And over the next 2 or 3 years, we played a few more shows, so we saw them evolve into being global superstars. And there was a great deal to absorb from that. But at the end of it all, you realize that there are some things you can learn from, but you can't actually imitate, let alone replicate. So there was never any point in me trying to compete with Robert Plant as a singer. I actually knew that from early 1968, because before Zeppelin began, before Robert got the call from Jimmy Page, he turned up courtesy of the grandfather of British blues, Alexis Corner, who brought his protege along to a club we were playing at, empty club, by the way, and we were introduced to this willowy sort of, I suppose, confident but very quietly confident guy, and he said, "This is Robert. He's a friend of mine. He's going to be a big star. And can he get in? Can he sit in with you guys and join you for a song or two?" And I said, "What does he do?" He said, "Well, he sings and he plays harmonica." And I said, "Oh, well, that's what I do. So, sure, but to give him, let him have his moment, then I'll just go sit at the side and watch." And so, Robert Plant got up and did a couple of songs with the other 3 guys, and as soon as he opened his mouth, I thought, "Uh-oh," this guy has obviously some real special kind of quality, which I knew was out of my league to work in that way, and so it was never in my mind that I could directly compete with Robert Plant in any way, either in terms of a stage performer or as a vocalist. And I had to look at what could I do that I could do reasonably well and make a name for myself by doing. And so playing the flute was one thing, and being a songwriter, producer, rather than vocalist primarily. I never really thought of myself as that being my main function. Was not to be a vocalist. I was a singer by default. Nobody in the band could sing, so I became the singer because I gave it a go, and it always seemed. There were bands that had singers who just sang, but I think most of the bands I liked, they were bands where somebody played a musical instrument and sang, whether it was a keyboard instrument or whether it was a singing bass player like Jack Bruce or a singing guitar player like Peter Green or whoever it might be. I always felt rather drawn to the bands where the singer actually did more than one job. And when you had a band where there was just a singer, like Yes, it I don't know, it's not to suggest that John Anderson didn't pull his weight. He was a huge part of what you thought of Yes as being was his very unique vocal style, but he didn't very often play anything on stage. Well, tambourine a lot.
Sometimes guitar.
I know that he could play guitar and write songs and all the rest of it, but his major function was to stand there in the centre of the stage and be a singer. And I suppose you'd say the same thing about Eric Burdon and a whole bunch of other people. Mick Jagger, obviously, they were singers in a band, but somehow, I don't know, they didn't, for me personally, they didn't quite have the musical authority as an instrumentalist who also sang.
I've got one last one for you from Kevin Hoover, and it's an interesting question. I think he said you learned fairly recently that your fingerings to get the notes were technically incorrect, but has that changed your playing at all?
Well, that was back in 1991 when my daughter was quite young at the time. Was in her music lessons at school. Was I think all the children were asked to, find an instrument to play, and so I loaned a flute to her. And she was learning to play the flute at school and had the most basic how to play the flute book one. And it showed the fingering chart and so on. And she was struggling with something, and I tried to help her. And she said, "But Daddy, that's not how you play the note. Your fingers aren't in the right place." I said, "What do you mean?" "Of course it is." "No, Daddy, look, it's in the book here. You're supposed to have your little finger on there." Well, I couldn't because I have a damaged little finger, a bent finger. It doesn't easily work the three notes, or the four notes that are down there at the bottom on a B foot flute. So I had kind of invented my own fingering when I first picked up the flute. And I never had a flute lesson, so I didn't know I was doing it wrongly. But I was in India. It was the day after the Air India building bombing, terrorist bombing in Bombay, as it used to be called, and I'd flown out to do some press and promo, and to a deserted Bombay, and I was in the hotel next door to the one that had been blown up, and every journalist in town had come to the press conference because there was nothing else to do. There was nobody in town to talk to, so everybody was lying low because of the terrorist attack. And so they all came to the press conference, and I remember being in the hotel room and seeing a fax machine, which is very unusual to find in a hotel room then, and even rarer now. Mm-hmm. And I, for just on a moment of whimsy, decided to send a fax to a music store in London and say, "Can you send me a copy of the fingering chart for the flute?" And an hour or so later, rattle, 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 off the fax machine came a fingering chart, and I looked at it and thought, bloody hell, this is whoops. So I resolved to try and learn to play correctly. And at the same time, I switched to playing an open hole flute, where some of the keys have a central hole, which allows you to create those. It's rather like bending a note on a guitar. You can create these almost microtonal differences, and I made that big switch in, I think, 90 or 91, and I spent about 3 or 4 months really trying to master this whole new approach to the instrument, and it was pretty scary because I knew that it was like having two things in your head at the same time. Yeah. And you really, really had to concentrate I had to concentrate very hard to go on stage and perform, to try to use the correct fingering, the correct techniques, and it was a tough few months really to make the switch, but it gave me a whole new viewpoint on the flute as a main instrument that I felt immediately empowered to make it, push it more to the fore, not just as an effect, not just as a bit of rock and roll extravaganza, but to actually play it more correctly and expand my ability and what I could do with the instrument, to encompass an area that I'd avoided because frankly I couldn't make it sound that way. So I worked on my embouchure. I worked on performing without, playing the flute without singing at the same time, which was damaging my voice anyway, doing that, and along with the smoke machines on stage. So I started to play the flute a little bit more correctly, or much more correctly, and I found that a very enjoyable thing to do. And I guess on stage, on a typical show, I'm still using the flute in the way that I used to do it early on, when that's appropriate, but at other times I play it with a much more pure quality of sound. And I can play it much louder than I used to be able to because I'm using the correct fingering and I'm breathing correctly and, I've improved my embouchure. So I have much more tonal variation, much more dynamic variation as a flute player now than I did, 30 years ago.